So we're on chapter 21 and on to Theodore Roosevelt. I already went over this video on Theodore Roosevelt on his administration, but I wanted to go over a little bit on his life because of all the presidents, we see him on Mount Rushmore and we always think, why is Teddy Roosevelt up there with, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln? What did he do? And what was his life like? And we'll find so much on his life because basically he had the crazy, in fact, there's an article called The Insane True Story of Teddy Roosevelt. All the things that he did, because he was very much of an enigma, and he was such an active in many areas, not just as a politician or not just as president. In fact, many of his roles were very contradictory. In fact, he was a war hero. He was a hero in war, but he also had the Nobel Peace Prize. So hero in war and hero in peace. He was a big game hunter, especially in Africa. I don't know how many hundreds of big game did he bring back, in taxidermy and such. But he also was a passionate conservationist in the midst of basically saving game's life, basically environmentalist, so he was both, in preserving national wildlife. So a big game hunter that preserved national wildlife, both. He was also a vigorous athlete, but he studied so much, he read a book a day. He was intellectual. He wrote books, in fact, and he read books like mad. And he wrote speeches that were 55 pages long. In the midst of this, he was an athlete, basically swimming and wrestling and boxing and jumping into rivers and taking dips whenever he wanted to. He was a New York aristocrat. He was born into wealth. And so he basically had, the silk shirts and, in the midst of the politician environment, yes. But he also went into being a cowboy. As his retreat, he went into being a Badlands cowboy. In the midst of his cowboy times, he became a sheriff and chased after bandits and an Indian fighter, basically, and an Indian lover. He was an enigma to the Indians. They didn't know whether to trust him or not, but they trusted him in the midst of that enigma. So when you think, he also was a legislator and a commissioner, a naval secretary, a governor, the vice president of the United States, and the president of the United States. He was a trust buster, and he was also had his own bull moose party, riding a bull moose. You could imagine that. All in the busy life of Theodore Roosevelt. So when you think of that, the criminals actually protest. They brought him in to fight crime in New York. And then in New York, the politicians that were criminals fought against him. In the midst of all this, he said, he ended up shutting down the saloons for Sunday school, or basically one day, and they actually went about doing that in the midst of thinking, what does he want to do? Is he legalistic or what? In the point of that. So a lot of people just said he was so active. He drank a lot of coffee, I'll say that. But he was also, they said, a locomotive in human pants. So he was always busy. But as you see this picture here, when he was a young child, they don't have a picture of him when he was a young child in this here, but when he was a young child, he was very, very sickly. And so he was dedicated to exercise. And basically, because he was a sickly child, people would bully him. So instead, he took up boxing and exerting and wrestling and judo and all these things, so that he could actually smash his bullies, which he did, in the midst of all this. And he was dedicated to exertion because he thought in exerting, he actually became stronger and outgrew his asthma. And he was credited first for the national forest, but in the midst of the national forest, the story came that he actually did not kill the bear, but actually would save the bear. And so teddy bear became very popular, and people started buying teddy bears. And wherever he'd go, they'd take out their teddy bears and wave their teddy bears. He was the first American president celebrity. And celebrity, whether teddy bears or whatever, America loved him. Into zoology and taxidermy, he would collect skins of animals. In fact, he collected so many bird skins. How gross is that? He collected all these bird skins and actually gave them to the Smithsonian Institute. So he was into zoology and taxidermy. So also he had one of the darkest days, a person's life is when you lose two members of your family or more at one time. So at 26 years old, he had married his young bride when he was 22, and they were having their first child. At the birth of their first child, 2 days later, she became sick and ended up dying on Valentine's Day. But the bad part was that not only did she die on Valentine's Day, but his mother came in and had typhoid fever and ended up dying just prior to this time. Just prior, a couple hours difference. And so, in fact, Teddy writes in his diary just a letter X and said, basically said, the light has gone out of my life, and writes an X. But now as depression set in, he thought, well, what if I were a cowboy? And that's where when he left to go out to the West and became a cowboy. He actually stopped stampedes and roundups, and he went out and caught bandits. In fact, 3 of them, 3 bandits. He became a real cowboy. And basically, even in the midst of all this, in Deadwood, they have a story of him. And he was basically sitting, he did drink and he didn't smoke, and he's sitting in Deadwood at this bar, and this drunk comes up and says, hey, Four Eyes, why don't you buy me a drink, or why don't you give me your money? And so he basically put his glasses down, stood up, and punched him in the mouth and sat down. So he became known as a tough guy in the midst, wearing his glasses and all. So basically later on, coming back, he married his second wife, who was his sweetheart from way back when he was a teenager. And they became quite a couple. And then they fought corruption in New York City in the midst. In fact, he actually arrested one of the big New York politicians there in the midst, and basically coming in, fighting the crime, the arresting of many police officers that were criminals in New York City, putting New York City straight, right? He was like a bull in a china closet many times. So, in fact, he's best known, this picture here of his as he went into fighting in the Spanish-American War, and he set forth, he actually was, commissioner of the Navy, secretary of the Navy. He ended up, resigning from that position, taking up a volunteer group of his friends and athletes, polo players, tennis players, Ivy League athletes, cowboys, Native Americans, miners, prospectors, hunters, and putting together and actually coming in to fight the battle in Cuba and San Juan Hill and Spanish, and winning and coming back a hero. This hero position actually gave him, as coming back as a politician, because of his status to run with President McKinley, he would run as vice president. Some of this is review, but I'm just reviewing because it's so important that you see how crazy his life was. So let's go on and I'm going to go through some things about his life that maybe you didn't know, or maybe I didn't go over. And basically, these are the true story of Teddy Roosevelt and some of the things you may not know. So he was incredibly active president with his bold reforms, his square deal, Panama Canal, naturalist. We went over those things. He was the youngest president ever at only 42 years old. When he came into the White House, he had 6 children. He actually kept a zoo in the White House, and he actually named the White House the White House. In fact, his daughter would bring her pony up in the White House elevator. Can you imagine that? So, and then he would take swims in the Potomac anytime he wanted. Basically skinny dipping in the Potomac River there, as he would basically, in those days, they would instead of taking a bath in a bathtub, he'd jump in the river. So anyway, another thing is his oldest daughter, Alice. Remember, that's the baby that he had with his first wife, who died in childbirth. And she was considered kind of a wild child. And he said, what am I going to do? And they said, well, what are you going to do with your daughter? He'd say, well, am I going to be able to control my daughter or run the country? So anyway, so she would try his patience. She was quite a deal. In fact, she would take her boa constrictor snake and put it around her neck, go on the top of the White House, and smoke cigars and cigarettes when she was a teenager. You can imagine. So, but anyway, and she became very, the news especially, they would come, and she became very popular too with American news. Again, Teddy Roosevelt, he drank coffee by gallons every day. And then when he was talking to the press, to the newspaper press that came in, the journalists, he would always bring them into his room when he was shaving. He had a special room that when they would come in and shave, and they would basically come in like a haircut, and then he would shave his beard. He would bring in the press, and he would talk to them while he was being shaved. And that gave him time that he could have with the press. And of course, in food safety, he had a beef with the beef industry, basically went in to meet inspections there and caused an overthrow in any of industry that was actually unsanitary, and basically made our food safe in America. When he was a child, he witnessed Lincoln's funeral, procession. And Abraham Lincoln was one of his favorite presidents, of course. And we know as a child, he also was a sickly child, but overcame by sheer force. He became a wimp to a warrior. So another is that when he was giving a speech for his bull moose party later on, he was actually shot. A guy came to assassinate him and shot him in the chest. But he had his 50-page notes underneath his coat, plus his eyeglass case, and so the bullet didn't go all the way deep inside of him, and he survived. But when he saw that he was surviving, he decided that he was just going to continue to deliver his speech. So he finished his speech while he was bleeding, and basically everyone looked and said, "What?" And he says, "Well, I'm going to talk really softly because I've been shot, but I'm just like a bull moose," he would say. So anyway, he dealt with his tragedy by going west and becoming a cowboy. And at that time, he captured 3 outlaws. He became deputy sheriff in that time. And of course, he punched out that bully in Deadwood, South Dakota. He took on the corrupt political machine, and he was that war hero. We went over that already. On his honeymoon, he climbed the Matterhorn. Can you imagine on your honeymoon, you decided, well, there's a mountain here, I think I'll go climb it. And that's what he did. He had a massive tattoo on his chest. Basically, it looked like his Roosevelt coat of armor or something on his chest. He was blind in one eye. As a president, he kept boxing. He took up boxing, and then they hit him in the eye, and he became blind in one eye, actually. Here's one. He helped invent and sustain the sport of football. Can you believe that? So whenever you watch a football game, you better think of Teddy Roosevelt. He also was a big game hunter in Africa. We know that. As he went to Africa, he brought back all of these different specimens of hunting in Africa. He nearly died exploring the uncharted river of the Amazon. He went down to the Amazon, him and his son, and they caught malaria. But out clear in the back, he lost 50 pounds, and he almost died out in the jungles of the Amazon River there, coming back. Nearly died there. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for peace in Russia and Japan, between the two of them, bringing that peace in. He even flew with the Wright brothers. You know, he was the first president to go up in an airplane. He was a proliferate writer, 50-page speeches even. He wrote constantly. He basically, during World War I, later on under President Woodrow Wilson, he said, well, I'm going to lead an infantry in there. So he was trying to get together and fight in the World War I. But because he was older then, and the President Wilson basically said, no way, he couldn't do that. But all 4 of his sons went into the war. In fact, his son Quentin died in World War I as flying airplanes in World War I. He had a really good memory, photographic memory, and he has the world record of the most handshakes on one day, 8,000 plus handshake. He wanted to shake all of his fans, all of the citizens of the United States' hands. He was the first celebrity president, the first cowboy president. He was the father of the modern United States Navy. We wouldn't even have the Navy as it was if it weren't for Teddy Roosevelt. Of course, we know what he did in the Panama Canal, shorting our route, you know, from 16,000 miles around South America, going around with the Navy going, or with the ships going all the way around South America to only 8,000 miles. So when he went to Harvard, he was always the odd man out. But because he loved his wife, and anytime anyone would look at his girlfriend at that time, he would say, do you want to fight a duel? And so everyone would stay away from his girl, right? So he was like a man's man. And of course, we have him from being on the Mount Rushmore in South Dakota as a president, on to being in our teddy bears. That's Teddy Roosevelt. And he had Christian moral values and believed the Bible was so important in politics. The Indian natives, even though he forced a lot of them off the land because he made them into national parks, but in the midst of all that, a lot of the natives still loved him as that president cowboy that related to them. As for the African Americans, the blacks, you know, in the point of he invited Booker T. Washington for dinner. That was a big deal back then because no president had ever invited an African American for dinner, and he did. But he still, you know, didn't really represent, you know, civil rights as later on was needed with the black people, but they loved him too in the midst of all that. He had that, created that great white navy that toured around the world and showed basically that the United States had power, had a powerful navy, and that we would speak softly and carry a big stick. He traveled the world, you know, he traveled the world. Even when he wasn't president, he traveled the world and met all the royalties throughout the world, you know, and they would look at him and love him, and the world, kings and royalty want to talk to him, and people would cheer at him all over the world. He was celebrity in America and celebrity in the world. He was the only president to have a third party, his Bull Moose Party, although he didn't win because he divided the Republican Party. We'll find out that he almost did win. And he was the only president to really run for a third term, although Franklin Roosevelt was 4 terms but never ran for them, but he did. The last thing about him, well, 2 things about him. One thing, he would always say, each day he'd wake up and say, bring it on. And he said, the being the president of the United States is the funnest thing that I've ever done. You know, he was into being the president, and basically he was that fighter. But he also, the last thing is that he died at 60 years old in his sleep. You know, he was having some pain, went to the doctor, and they said, you know what, you have some problems here. And so instead of staying there, he says, well, I'm going to go home and take a nap, go to sleep. So he went home and went to sleep. In the night, he had a pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot, and died at 60 years old. But we all remember Teddy Roosevelt. And so that's what I wanted to go over, is these pictures here and all, you know, and is that he is one of the most famous celebrity presidents and did the most probably of any president in his short time as president of the United States. So it's very important that we know, and a lot of the things, what we are now in the United States is because of his stand and his stand for America. So despite some of his problems, you know, as we see in his life, you know, as we do, that he fought for America, America's public, for the public of America, for the people of America, for the citizens of America. Teddy Roosevelt.